Thanks for joining us. It's Spotlight here on WMKV and WLHS. This is a program where we look at everything from the arts to local issues, and occasionally we get to touch upon different events that are coming to Cincinnati. And this one is appropriately entitled Titanic, an Immersive Voyage. And you're going to understand that has multiple meanings here. It's been 40 years since the Titanic wreck was discovered by Navy officer Robert Ballard 400 miles off Newfoundland's coast, ending what turned out to be a 73-year mystery. Now we're marking this historic find. Exhibition Hub and the group Fever bring the Titanic story to life here downtown Cincinnati. It's going to be at a location space at 18 West 4th Street between Race and Vine. And this is called Titanic, an Immersive Voyage through the eyes of the passengers. Come aboard the Titanic on the fateful night of April 14th of 1912 when the unsinkable ship met its tragic end. And you can explore the wreck's rediscovery from Ballard in 1985 that captivated the world. You'll find artifacts, room recreations, 3D views, multimedia. And we have with us to talk more about this John Zaller, the executive producer of Exhibition Hub's Titanic, an Immersive Voyage, and a pioneer in these type of immersive experiences. Mr. Zaller, John, thank you so much for joining us here to talk more about the Titanic, and we're going to be talking later about Cincinnati connections to that tragedy. Tell us about Titanic, an Immersive Voyage that's coming here to Cincinnati.
Well, George, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure, as an Ohio native, to be bringing Titanic, an Immersive Voyage to Cincinnati. We're in the same space that Van Gogh, the Immersive Experience, was in, and Claude Monet, the Immersive Experience, just wrapped up in. So it's a wonderful location right downtown, which is booming these days. Mm-hmm. And Titanic, an Immersive Voyage will be a great addition to the cultural fabric of Cincinnati. What we've done with Titanic, an Immersive Voyage is place you in the story like never before. So that there's quite a few Titanic exhibitions that have traveled around the world. I've created a lot of them, and this is the one that I'm most proud of because that emotional connection through the eyes of the passenger is something that you feel in this experience like you've never felt before. We have over 200 artifacts from Titanic and her sister ship Olympic, as well as the rescue ship Carpathia and some of the other vessels that were involved in the rescue of Titanic, where we place you in the story using those artifacts because artifacts have such a real significance in terms of storytelling. But we also use multimedia to put you in the Titanic story in a way that you could never think of before these technologies became available.
If you're just joining us, John Zaller, the executive producer from Exhibition Hub, is joining us, and we're talking about Titanic, an Immersive Voyage that's going to be at 18 West 4th Street between Race and Vine. It's running March 13th through the spring and possibly into the summer. It should be an exciting time for everybody. John, tell us a little bit about this. Really, Robert Ballard, this was a secret mission, was it not?
Ballard had a very good sense of where Titanic was. He studied the route maps. He studied disturbances in the ocean floor. He did a lot of research. He was very, very passionate about the subject. He always was. But he needed special technology to verify the location. And this is a underwater autonomous vehicle or robot that he could use to dive to these extreme depths over 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the ocean to identify the ship itself. So he went to the U.S. Navy and he said, I've got this idea. I want to build this technology. This would be great for the discovery of the wreck of the Titanic. And the Navy said, that's great. We'll help you build it. But if we build it for you, you have to go and find these sunken submarines that are top secret. And if you have the time after that mission, if you can find those submarines, then with any time that's left in the mission window, we'll let you go and look for Titanic. So Ballard was able to identify those subs very quickly, and he had a few days left in the mission. They redirected towards Newfoundland, and on the last day of the mission, they discovered the wreckage of the Titanic, which made, of course, national news because the story of Titanic is so full of mystery, so full of drama, so full of tragedy, that it captivates us today just as it did then, just as it did at the time of the sinking. So when Ballard discovered it, it really became national news. It was also a great cover-up for the rest of his mission.
I can only begin to imagine the first images that they were seeing. And as I understand, it was September 1st of 1985, as we're looking at the 40th year after the discovery of the Titanic wreck. What was still intact from the Titanic itself? Can you tell us some of the images that Ballard first saw as he saw the Titanic for the first time since its sinking?
What Ballard determined was how the ship broke up. And he determined that it broke into two pieces based on historical references, based on the stories that were told. And he surmised that if that was the case, a lot of the contents of the ship would have spilled out into the ocean floor. So what he was looking for was non-organic, human-made materials that would help identify where the wreck was. So he started with his robot scanning to find anything that would look like of human origin on the ocean floor. And sure enough, he came across a massive oval shape, which was one of the boilers from the ship, one of these massive two-story boilers that you could actually fit a double-decker bus into. And that's when he knew he was on the trail to find the ship itself. And shortly after, following that trail of debris, he came across the bow section of the ship and was able to capture all of that imagery and bring it back to us just within a few days of discovering it.
Here on Spotlight, we're learning more about the Titanic, and it's been 40 years since the discovery of the wreckage of the Titanic in 1985. And coming to Cincinnati is an exhibition called Titanic: An Immersive Voyage. You can find out more at expo-titanic.com. That's a great website to go visit, and you can look for the Cincinnati dates there and ticketing, expo-titanic.com. We'll give that later in the program as well. More than 200 artifacts in this show. There are room recreations, 3D views. It looks like there may be VR even involved with this. John, would you say about an hour to an hour and a half is what you should allow for this experience?
It's about 75 minutes to 90 minutes in terms of the overall experience. When you first enter the experience, we want to first immerse you in the lore of the ship. So we talk about all the ways people have thought about, written about Titanic over the years. There's films that have been made. Dozens of books are written every year, even today, on the Titanic. But then we take you back in time. We take you back to Belfast, where the ship was built. And you're able to look at artifacts that tell you the story of how the ship was actually constructed. You enter the ship, you see the big steel plates to the side of the ship going into the ship, and then we take you through some of her rooms. The Titanic first-class dining room, the Titanic grand staircase, which was the crown jewel of the seas. And following that, we get into those ice warnings that came in throughout the journey, but especially on April 14th, 1912. Numerous ice warnings were coming in from other ships in the area saying, hey, there's significant ice in the area. And the Titanic steamed ahead at full speed. Her captain was very well seasoned crossing the seas. He was confident he was going to miss that iceberg because of the way he redirected the ship. And lo and behold, at 11:40 that night, Titanic struck an iceberg. So from there, we take you into an immersive gallery, about a 35-minute show, where you experience the Titanic like never before. You meet some of her passengers, you explore all of her decks, and you're a witness to the sinking of the ship and the recovery ship Carpathia coming to rescue the passengers 4 hours after Titanic sank. But, you know, George, one of the things that I think is really special about this experience is that virtual reality component that you mentioned. So we're talking about Bob Ballard discovering Titanic. We know there have been dozens and dozens of missions to the Titanic over the years. You're either using a robot from the surface of the ocean or you're looking through a really small porthole at the wreck. But what we've done with our VR experience is we take you to the wreck, and then through the magic of VR, we place you on an open ocean platform where you're actually circling the wreck, and you can see it like no one has ever seen it before. And it's a very powerful experience to witness that wreck in its final resting place. And it brings back all of that emotion that connects us to the story in ways that we never really thought were imaginable.
It is amazing what can be done with digital technology today, and taking the images that Bob Ballard found when he first found the Titanic, and then taking what we know now and being able to augment that reality to create the most lifelike experience. No wetsuit needed, though. We don't need wetsuits for this. And we're going to talk in a moment just about the Cincinnati connection, which I knew about Albert Anthony Stewart, but there are more, as John Zaller is telling us here on this program on Spotlight. We're talking about Titanic, an immersive voyage. It is running March 13th through the spring and into the summer. If we have good attendance for this, it should be a wonderful experience. It is in the same location where you may have had the immersive experience with Van Gogh or Monet. It's at 18 West 4th Street. That's between Race and Vine downtown, allowing about 75 to 90 minutes for this. And we have John Zaller here with us, who is the executive producer of Exhibition Hub, and he has been involved with so many different projects involving the Titanic. More about the Cincinnati connection, and I was marginally aware of Albert Anthony Stewart, but you were telling me before the interview that there were other Cincinnati-connected people who were on the historic cruise of the Titanic.
Albert Anthony has a really interesting story. He was a poster manufacturer and made these incredible posters for Barnum and Bailey Circus, among other great promotions. Sadly, he was lost in the tragedy. One of the passengers that I thought would be of great interest to you, George, as a journalist, is Edith Louise Rosenbaum, who's from Cincinnati. She was a fashion buyer and a stylist and a correspondent for Women's Wear Daily. We, before the interview, got this connection. Edith Rosenbaum had this toy mechanical pig that she loved, and it was her lucky pig. So when she heard the word, put your life vest on, go to the boat deck, she went back to her cabin and grabbed her mechanical pig, and that was her lucky pig. She ended up in a lifeboat, and she used that pig to entertain the passengers on board the lifeboat who were terrified, to help distract them from the freezing cold night and the uncertainty of what was to come next. And it just so happens Cincinnati is also known as Porkopolis.
Sure.
So there's a great connection there all the way around.
Were there other Cincinnati connections?
There were a few other Cincinnati connections. Clara Froenthal was a first-class passenger. There's another passenger who was from Cincinnati, moved to South Africa, and was working as a blacksmith and was coming back to Cincinnati to care for his aged mother. So that's the fascinating thing about Titanic is there were over 2,200 passengers on board the ship. They all have these incredible stories, and they have hundreds of stories associated with them. We're still connected to those stories. So the more research we do, the more we dig, the more we find the connections to Cincinnati. So even during the run of the show, I know we're going to have people who are going to call us and say, hey, my great-grandfather was on Titanic, or I have this artifact that was brought off the ship by someone who was on board. Those connections continue to be discovered every time we open in a new city.
I wanted to mention Albert Anthony Stewart. This is from some of the publicity that was sent, but I was not aware that he had said this. Helping other people survive the Titanic. One of the survivors, Helen Bishop, heard him say, "You four kiddies stay together and get in the first lifeboat. I'll be right back here." And he perished helping others basically survive the Titanic sinking. As you said, each one of these individuals has a story, whether we know them all now or not, or as we learn them. My question to you, John Zaller, is you already knew so much about the Titanic from your previous work on exhibitions around the Titanic. Have you learned new things during Titanic, an Immersive Voyage?
Well, without a doubt. Every time I work on a Titanic subject, I learn something new, or I see a new angle. The angle that struck me this time, we always talk about Titanic as the most glorious ship that ever sailed. I sometimes thought about that as a euphemism because Titanic was the largest ship at the time and tragically sank on its maiden voyage. But actually talking to naval architecture historians, they confirm that the handiwork on Titanic by the Irish craftsmen who built it in Belfast was the finest craftsmanship that ever went into building a ship, then or now. So the level of detail that went into building that ship, the amount of pride, the Irish pride that went into building that ship is unsurpassed. And that was something that really struck me. Also, when you see the artifacts You see these elements that went into building the ship. You really see the beauty, you see the care, you see the detail that went into it. Another thing that always gets me whenever I'm working on Titanic is the fact that there's a phrase, "We are all passengers on Titanic." The more I work on Titanic, the more I think that's true. It's a complete cross-section of all of society, all of humanity on board that ship, from the wealthiest individuals who were around at the time to the poorest people in the world who were hoping for a better life. They were all on board that ship in those cross sections, basically from top to bottom, the way the decks were arranged. But their fates were all equalized by that tragic night on the ocean. And you ask the question, what would I have done had I been there? And I think that it always leads to soul searching, wondering how you would have acted in that incredible circumstance of the sinking of an unsinkable ship in the middle of the ocean.
And I think anyone who's ever been on a cruise has to have something like that maybe flash through their mind, even if it's not during the cruise. You may think back to that historic cruise of the Titanic, and as you said, what would I do should there be an emergency, and how would I react? I want to come back to some of the other images that you have discussed. You mentioned the grand staircase. How did you recreate that, the hull? How did you recreate that and some of the other elements of the Titanic based on those photographs?
Everything that we have recreated in terms of sets is taken from the original drawings of the ship and then extrapolated to a one-to-one view. If you're looking at the side of the ship's wall when you're entering the ship, you see the steel plates at their size of 6 feet tall by 20 feet wide. You see the rivet reinforcements that were holding those steel plates together. You see those extra steel plates that add that structure. With the grand staircase, when you approach it, you're actually seeing the size of the grand staircase as you come upon it. And in the first-class dining room, you're seeing a section of the first-class dining room as it was designed to be on the ship. So we're placing you on the Titanic in a way that you feel its grandeur, you feel its incredible importance, and you feel the beauty of its design.
I have to ask because I think some older people may sometimes have reservation about virtual reality, maybe using goggles. This is a safe experience for people to be in this enhanced reality, correct?
Without a doubt. One of the things that Exhibition Hub has always done and always aspires to do is to push the envelope in terms of storytelling. And we do see a lot of folks that are pulled back from virtual reality because it's too complicated or too complex. But what we've done is we've made it very simple for you. You put on a pair of goggles, you're following a path, you are actually walking through this experience. And once you're in there, any of those concerns all just wash away because you're witnessing this dive to the wreck site that could never before be done without the magic of virtual reality.
We're talking about Titanic and Immersive Voyage, which is in Cincinnati, March 13th, running through the spring and possibly into the summer. The location at 18 West 4th Street, and that's where you may have experienced the Immersive Monet or the Immersive Van Gogh experience. It mentions as well that there are some hands-on capabilities. What are some of the hands-on things that visitors can do?
In Titanic and Immersive Voyage, everybody gets a boarding pass when they first enter. So they've got that boarding pass with them, and on that boarding pass, you have the name of an actual passenger who is on board the ship. And you learn a little bit about their life story. And we take you right up to the moment of boarding the ship. So when you're experiencing the ship itself, you're walking through it maybe with a little bit of that perspective. I'm a second-class passenger on Titanic coming from rural England. I'm a third-class passenger coming from Eastern Europe with hopes of a new life. I'm a wealthy first-class passenger. It helps you change your perspective. And at the end of the experience, you see a memorial wall with all of those names on it. And you see whether your passenger, who you identify with so closely, has either survived or been lost in the tragedy. Following that, we encourage guests to write out a Marconigram to their passenger to share their thoughts about the experience. And that's a really powerful moment where people find these incredible ways to express themselves and connect with their passengers by writing out these beautiful letters to their passengers.
It's been 40 years since the wreck of the Titanic was discovered. The Titanic sunk in 1912, but the wreck was discovered in 1985 by Bob Ballard, who was a Navy officer who was actually on a secret mission doing some other work. And then with the time left over, as we learned from John Zaller here on today's program, was able to find the Titanic, which was his original goal to do this. There are artifacts, and I understand that there are some collectors and people whose artifacts, these are one-offs, I have a feeling. What kind of artifacts can people expect to see? I understand not just from the Titanic, but from the Carpathia, the Olympic, and possibly others.
That's right. We have brought together some of the finest collectors in the world who have dedicated decades to building up these collections of Titanic and related artifacts. We have artifacts from the shipyard at Harland and Wolff, rivets from the Titanic. We have furniture that was brought off of the ship prior to its sailing. And then we have some incredible pieces that are from Titanic's twin sister ship, Olympic, the ship that actually managed to sail the ocean for over 30 years back and forth across the Atlantic. And the exact copy of Titanic was sailing through World War I all the way up to the advent of World War II as a troop ship and a passenger ship. So when it was decommissioned, all of those incredible pieces were then available for collectors to gather. So we have some great examples of the woodworking, of the furniture, of the china and the silver from Titanic that were on board Olympic. And it gives you this sense of the glory and the grandeur of the ship, because when you think about Titanic today, it's a wreck at the bottom of the ocean that's slowly deteriorating. But when you can step back in time and see these pieces from Olympic that sailed all those years on the ocean, you can really appreciate the beauty and the glory of the ship itself.
And just as we talk about preserving the golden age of radio at this radio station or any kind of historic event, as this ship is deteriorating, it is so important for us to grasp it while we can. And that's why Titanic, an Immersive Voyage, which has a double meaning in this case, is so important. It is running March 13th. Running through the spring, and we have John Zaller here, the executive producer from Exhibition Hub, who is bringing this to Cincinnati. And once again, the location is going to be at 18 West 4th Street. That location is between Race and Vine on West 4th. More than 200 artifacts, 3D views, multimedia, room recreations, an incredibly immersive experience. And tickets, as I understand, John, tickets are at expo-titanic.com. Can they find the information there?
That's right. So that's the best place to get tickets. And the show is going to be open every day except Tuesdays, opening at 10 a.m. during the week and at 9 a.m. on the weekends. We also have great educational materials for the school groups who want to come out. We have wonderful group packages as well. And as we were talking, George, downtown Cincinnati is really booming. It's a great trip to make into the city. There's plenty of parking available, and you can really make a day of it in Cincinnati. We'll be 90 minutes or 2 hours of your day, but then you've got an extra half a day to go and explore the city itself with all of its new offerings that are happening right there along West 4th and right at Fountain Square.
Exactly. And then, of course, not far from there, a stone's throw, is Cincinnati Museum Center as well. So you make a full day of it and learn about the Titanic and go find out about trains and all kinds of incredible things. I know you've been involved with St. Louis and Union Station there. So this is something I'm sure near and dear to your heart as well. But this is probably unlike any other Titanic experience you've had before. In the final moments, John, and we'll give all the information here again at the end of the program about how to get tickets when it's running. We've heard about the Olympic, the Britannic, the Carpathia, the Californians also mentioned. Can you give us a quick thumbnail of these ships and how they all interacted with the Titanic?
We have Titanic, which is the glorified ship of the North Atlantic that tragically struck an iceberg on its maiden voyage. It's almost like a Greek tragedy. We have two other ships that were built identical to Titanic at the same shipyards at Harland and Wolff in Ireland. The Britannic met a tragic end as a naval hospital ship in World War One, it struck a mine in the Aegean Sea, and it's laying on the bottom of the ocean. So you have two of the most glorious ships ever built that sank. But then you have Olympic, its twin sister ship, that sailed for over 30 years on the ocean, and another floating palace that we're able to learn so much about Titanic from. Mm-hmm. Then we have the Carpathia, who was a kind of a lowly steamer by Titanic's main competition line, Cunard Lines, who sailed through the night, avoiding dozens of icebergs in a massive ice field to get to Titanic's passengers. The only reason we know anything about the Titanic tragedy is because the Carpathia rescued those 700-plus passengers who were able to get into lifeboats. Then we have the Californian, which was only 20 miles away and essentially watching the disaster happen, but wasn't aware because of the conventions of the time, didn't know what rockets meant, had turned off its radio, so it couldn't assist. So there's this extra pull of the heartstrings of, if California had responded to those distress calls, everybody probably would have survived. Then you have numerous other ships from the McKay Bennett that went back to the wreck site and pulled bodies out of the water, hundreds of bodies out of the water that were then buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but at the same time recovered items from the surface of the ocean. Some of those items are on display as well. So there's a whole host of ships that were operating in the North Atlantic at this time, but one ship with one iceberg on a lonely night in freezing cold conditions led to this incredible tragedy.
John Zaller, I want to thank you so much for taking this time with us on Spotlight today. Once again, he is the executive producer of Exhibition Hub, who is bringing this program here in the same space where you might have experienced the Immersive Van Gogh or the Immersive Monet exhibits downtown Cincinnati, 18 West 4th Street. Again, between Race and Vine, if you're coming to Cincinnati and aren't familiar with the area, they even have a map on the website where you can find out more about the location. Tickets at expo-titanic.com, and you can look up Cincinnati. You can also find out what other cities it will be appearing in. It is running March 13th, running through the spring and possibly into the summer here, depending on how well it's received here. I think it's going to be very well received because we don't often get a look at history quite this, immersive again. John, I want to thank you for all that you're doing to bring history to life, to bring it here to Cincinnati, and help us learn more about the history of the high seas, but also about the frailty of the human condition as well.
Thank you so much, George, and thank you for keeping radio alive. And really, as I said at the beginning of the program, as an Ohio native, it's really an honor to bring Titanic and Immersive Voyage back to Ohio for everybody to enjoy it.
Thank you so much. John Zaller from Titanic and Immersive Voyage. You can find out more here at the radio station as well, or go to expo-titanic.com. You've been listening to Spotlight here on WMKV and WLHS. Thanks for being with us.